We all experience significant coincidences or synchronicity in life. What follows is my story, but I believe it's likely that we all exist in a state of what I call persistent synchronicity. A long time ago, I started writing mine down, especially any related to my artwork. Recently, I decided to lay them all out and research them. Some connected to family history, some were integral to the creation of an artwork, some seemed to spin off directly because of an artwork, and some, as I researched them, led to the discovery of more coincidences. And they all seem to be related to a common theme. I'm convinced they aren't random. There's a persistent synchronicity at work here. Where to start? Well, in the middle, obviously. After graduating from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, I wanted to continue my artwork involving synchronicity. I applied to the Banff Center for the Arts, one of the premier residency programs in the world. The head of the ceramics program, Les Manning, called me and said he liked my work and my proposal to explore synchronicity, and could I come up for an interview. I said I couldn't afford it. He said they would still consider me, but I wasn't optimistic. Right around then, my friend Joe asked me to be in a Halloween costume contest with him. We went as the Wind.
Win the big money, right? And we didn't know what we were really going to win or what was going to happen.
What happened was we won, and the prize just happened to be a trip to go to Banff right when I needed to be there for the interview.
It was second place, which was, to me, I was disappointed. I'm like, oh, they're like, no, Joe, I need to go to Canada. This is a major opportunity for me. So,
and it was. A crazy coincidence was helping me to make art about previous crazy coincidences. 30 years later, I decided to do an homage to that important time in my life with a painting that I half seriously expected to trigger a synchronistic experience. I called it Sync Generator. As for what happened the day after I finished it, well, therein lies the tale. I was anti-war growing up, mostly because of my brother Mark, who was a conscientious objector during Vietnam. But it became deeper with an experience I had with my Uncle Chester in 1987. I wrote about it in 2002 after he had passed away. In 2013, I'd learned that the U.S. government was preparing to allow military drones to operate freely in domestic airspace. I had doubts about the wisdom of that, and so I started researching and blogging about it. One thing I discovered was that the testing program wasn't a secret or anything. You could just type in the tail number of a military drone and watch it fly around the US, or anywhere in the world, really. The day after finishing the Sync Generator, I had time to go back to that other hobby, tracking drones. Before looking at any new ones, I wanted to go back and look at one that had flown all over the United Kingdom the previous year. This was the principal demonstrator model of their newest drone, the MQ-9B Sky Guardian, which was developed in part to cement the close working relationship between the American and British Air Forces. It had performed a really unusual flight out of Royal Air Force Base Waddington one day in 2021. I had seen this flight before, but this time I was struck by how the flight resembled a clock face, especially since if you rewind it, it appeared that it was intentionally timed to pass over the 12 o'clock position precisely at the top of the hour. That, of course, reminded me of the classic film about American bomber crews in World War II operating out of bases in the United Kingdom.
High squadron, low squadron, here they come. 12 o'clock high. Watch it come, they're heading for the high squadron.
Just for reference, my Uncle Chester had been one of those pilots. On a whim, I zoomed in on the point at the top of that clock face to see what might be there. There was an unusual shape there, located precisely due north of the Waddington Control Tower. It was the International Bomber Command Center, a museum and monument to the international effort to bomb Nazi Germany in World War II. I realized I had seen an image many times that reminded me closely of the shape of that monument. It was the San Diego headquarters of the company that had made the drone and was operating it as it circled over the IBCC. I compared the shapes as best I could using Google Images. Leaving aside the sizes and external differences, the shapes were close to identical. I sent the combined images to a few contacts and finally went back to the list of drones I hadn't seen before. The flight path for the first one I looked at didn't make any sense. A 50-mile long arc like I've never seen before or since, just outside Edwards Air Force Base in California. It flew that pattern for 6 hours. The next day, I checked the tracking website and found that that same drone had flown again overnight. It had flown back and forth, and it had landed literally minutes before I got up. The second flight path was almost identical to the first. And those images I had been sharing just 2 days before, these two drone flight paths fit into them perfectly, making them complete circles, as if they had been drawn that way deliberately. So, to recap, I did a painting half seriously meant to trigger a coincidence, and within 48 hours of finishing it, a coincidence of bizarre complexity that only I would notice had occurred not once, but twice. And it suggested a connection between my interest in military drones and that earlier coincidence featuring my Uncle Chester. I decided to take another look at it. In 1987, I was living with cousins Pat and Pete in Amherst, Massachusetts. One day my Uncle Chester came for a visit. He led a very interesting life. He worked at IBM developing computer components. He was active in the Quaker community. And during World War II, he'd been stationed in England at an RAF base near the coast. He'd been an officer, a B-24 pilot, and a squadron leader in the 389th Bombing Group. This was one of the units that actor Jimmy Stewart flew with and was part of the inspiration for the classic film 12 O'Clock High. Pat, one of the writers in the family, persuaded Chester to tell us some stories about his experience as a pilot during World War II. He was reluctant, as he had become a Quaker later in life and deeply regretted his part in taking lives, even in a just war. Around noon, we sat on the porch with Pat and Pete, drinking iced tea, and listened to what it was like for a young man to face death and reign death and live with the consequences for the rest of his life. Finally, Chester told the story about an especially difficult bombing run over the German town of Ludwigshafen. He didn't like talking about it, as he knew that they must have killed many civilians. After a pause, Peter said quietly, "You know, my family is from Ludwigshafen." There was a long silence as we all contemplated the idea of one branch of a family dropping bombs on the other. After it was all over, I did this drawing and tucked it away. 2 days after that, after Chester had left, Pat and Pete's teenage daughter Bethany called from Germany. She had had dinner with Peter's surviving relatives and heard about the bombing in Ludwigshafen on the same day we heard it from Chester, 4,000 miles away. That was a pretty big coincidence, especially now that I've realized that given the times of day that they each happened, and factoring in the 6-hour time difference, it appears likely that these conversations were happening simultaneously. This was the point where I realized I had to start investigating other coincidences. There was one from 1986 that always bugged me, but you'll need a little background first. I once did an installation on the main building of the Kansas City Art Institute. Ceramic tiles, painted to match the stone, were in conflict with those painted to match the bricks. I later used remnants of it to make standalone pieces, like the one I planned to take down to the gallery in Fort Smith, Arkansas. Our gang, the Art Patrol, had gotten a group show, and we all piled ourselves and our art into several cars and headed south. Around halfway there, something funny happened. We had this Laurie Anderson cassette on, and Sharky's Day was playing. The lyric, "I'd rather see this on TV," played just as a highway sign whizzed past.
I'd rather see this on TV.
The rhyme and the timing made me laugh. I tried explaining what happened to the others in the car, and when I got to the line, "I'd rather see this on TV,"
I'd rather see this on TV.
the next sign whizzed past, synced up like a music video. We all laughed, and I've wondered what this odd little coincidence meant ever since. Now, 37 years later, I go on Google Maps and discover that if we had gotten off at that exit and stopped at the very first stoplight we came to, we would have been sitting in front of the spot where my Uncle Chester grew up, right up until he volunteered to join the Army to become a pilot. But I didn't know that at the time, and we went on to Fort Smith and had a fantastic weekend, and I sold my first piece of art, one of the ones based on conflict. This would be a recurring theme, the conflict imagery and the coincidences that kept happening in connection to each one. Insignificant at first, but the more I paid attention to them, the more significant they got, or at least that's the way it felt.
Sun's coming up like a big bald head.
Arriving at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago's ceramics program, one of the first pieces I made was that one I had done a drawing of the year before. During critiques, one fellow student said she wanted to appreciate the ceramic panels, but that the steel components distracted her. My response was, "Okay, but the clay's the thing." I wasn't deliberately making a joke or referencing Hamlet's scheme to expose his father's murder, but it stuck in my head. And when I started the next, more ambitious sculpture, I named it "The Clay's the Thing." I had finished most of the sculpture, the last part being the slip-cast salmon. Since I was making so many, they had me mix an entire batch of the casting slip myself. I followed the recipe for 400 pounds of slip, but at the end, it wouldn't work. The slip was the wrong consistency by a lot. I had to dump it out and start over. The second time, the same result. This was getting really frustrating. I sat down with all the instructors and the ceramic department technician to try to figure out what I was doing wrong. I'd followed the casting slip recipe precisely, but it just wouldn't work. Suddenly, one of them asked, "Wait, which fire clay did you use?" I told her I had used the Mexilloy fire clay, as instructed by the ceramics tech. They all looked at him, and he hung his head.
I said, "Well, there's the problem. You need to go back and use AP green fire clay." and he had substituted a fire clay, and I immediately realized that that particular fire clay was a very fine particle size and would give lots of problems in the way a casting slip behaved.
No, you have to go back and use the AP green fire clay. After I switched to the AP green fire clay, the casting slip worked perfectly, and I was able to finish the sculpture, The Clay's the Thing. Some months later, while reading some family history from my Uncle Robert, I learned that my father had been able to go to engineering school in the first place because of a scholarship from the AP Green Fire Clay Company. He had originally studied ceramic engineering, but with the war starting, that turned into military engineering. He served in World War II, including helping to plan and carry out the D-Day landings in France, which he talked about with my Uncle Chester at the time. After the war, he went into aerospace design. He shared patents on some of the earliest control systems for guided missiles. He eventually became head of advanced aircraft design at McDonnell Douglas. But for a while, my father was a ceramic engineer. At this point in 1990 that I realized I needed to focus on making art about synchronicity. I applied to go to Banff, and you know how that turned out. Here's what happened when I went up for that interview. I hitchhiked from the ski resort down to Les Manning's office at Banff. I sat down, and this was the interview. "Well, you're in, okay?" He told me later that after the way I'd been able to show up there, they were afraid not to accept me.
Sure, oh, I've described that many times too, because it was an unusual way for somebody to get to Banff in the first place, Halloween costume. It may have given that little extra kick since we got to meet you.
Apparently, that's why Les said that although I'd only applied for one 3-month session, would you like to stay for 2? This is how I wound up sitting next to people in 1992 who would later figure prominently in this story, which is hard to tell in a linear fashion because of things that happen while trying to tell it. Case in point. In 1987, I learned that my father had been a lead designer on the Minuteman missile. I had only ever heard his job described as experimental aircraft design, so learning that he had helped develop America's first ICBM was a surprise. I walked over to the university a few blocks away to clear my head. In one of the galleries, there was a video of an artist talking about her father having worked on Cold War-era nuclear missiles too. Now, 2023, for this project, I try to track down the name of this artist. I call a museum to see how to do that and get Jennifer Lynn, collection manager, on the phone. I tell her why I was looking for this artist. The video about her father, my father, Minuteman missile, Synchronicity, my father was a ceramic engineer, etc. And I really wasn't prepared for what she said next.
My father also worked on the Minuteman missile. I said, my father also worked on the Minuteman missile, and he was also a ceramic engineer. For me, I don't hear about many people who know what a ceramic engineer is. So it was pretty interesting, but it was pretty strange to hear you say that. You had mentioned copper. You were looking for Copper Gilleth, and I don't think you knew that was who it was at the time. And I've known Copper since the late 80s, around when that exhibition happened, and that you were looking for.
I was able to talk to Copper, and she confirmed that her father had worked on Cold War-era nuclear missiles, so that made 3 of us. Furthermore, he had landed on the beach at Normandy during the war, just like my dad. I'm still pulling on that thread. Meanwhile, back to the months leading up to my Banff residency. In 1991, the ceramics department at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago arranged for us to have a group show at Fermilab, the giant research facility west of Chicago. The piece I submitted was a component of The Clay's the Thing. At the opening, I was introduced to a scientist who wanted to purchase it. He said it reminded him of his work running subatomic particle collisions, and also the problem that they keep running into. He said, "The math is unassailable. The engineering is bulletproof. The observations are conclusive. Subatomic particles change their behavior when we watch them." I was intrigued and honored that he wanted to buy my sculpture. Speaking of collisions, on the day before the show was to come down, someone destroyed that sculpture. While trying to find out what happened, I was told that the photos that were taken of the event were restricted. In 2018, I tried to track down the person who had run the Fermilab gallery at the time, Sandra Poches. I was told she had retired and returned to her original love, ceramics. This is her at an art show in Hendersonville, North Carolina in 2011, which is remarkable in that I was literally a block away. This is the only one I could verify, but we almost certainly crossed paths at local art shows many times over the years. Subatomic particles change their behavior when we watch them. I learned later that what he's referring to there is called the observer effect, among other names. It's been torturing physicists for decades, including, apparently, his research partner of many years. A while ago he just snapped, he said. He hums and gardens a lot now. He said that they lose people every year who can't stay on the tightrope between physics and metaphysics. I've thought a lot about that conversation over the years. The installation I eventually finished at Banff and showed there just one time was called My Father Was a Ceramic Engineer. It included references to my father's evolution from ceramics to missile design to various ceramic processes in the making of the Clay's the Thing, and some of the synchronicities that had occurred up to that point. The horse design refers to the voodoo concept of a god coming down and riding a person around our world. Sometimes I still feel that way, chasing down coincidences as if I'm not the author of my own life. I also included the clip of Robert Oppenheimer expressing his regrets.
Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. I suppose we all thought that, one way or another.
One of the we all in that sentence was physicist Frederick de Hoffman. After Los Alamos, he went to work for the people who had built Chester's B-24, General Dynamics, to create a new company, General Atomics. The original mission was to find peacetime uses for atomic energy, which they still do. But after changing hands a few times, they are now best known for making military drones like the Predator, Reaper, and the new Sky Guardian, which they and the US government are aggressively marketing to our allies around the world. The European hub of this eventual globally connected force will be in the UK, specifically at the Waddington RAF base. This global surveillance fleet will be symbolically watched over from the high noon position by the place that first caught my attention as resembling the General Atomics headquarters, the International Bomber Command Center, where they celebrate the culture of a world war gone by and prepare children for the days to come. Maybe that's unfair, but if I were writing a screenplay about people preparing for World War III, this might be how I would start it. At least this is the impression I've taken from the string of coincidences that led me here and keep happening as I explore it. It was the first day of my second session in the Banff ceramics department. There were 10 of us from all over the world. As the 3 of us from the United States introduced ourselves and said where we were from, it turned out we all grew up within 5 miles of each other, in the suburbs of St. Louis. I turned to look at Les and his assistant Ed, and they were both staring at me. Finally, Les said, "Knock it off, Barry," as if I could just turn this whole coincidence thing on or off at will. Now, 2024, I try to locate exactly where we each lived, so I could be sure I'm right when I say we all grew up within 5 miles of each other. I searched online for addresses for both Deborah and Catherine. I located them as accurately as I could along with where I had grown up. I discovered that in fact it was closer to 7 miles apart, but who's counting? Then, I don't know why, it occurred to me to do this with that Polaroid that someone had taken of us 32 years before. And while you're calculating how improbable this is, don't forget to factor in that these are in the right order. That's what we in the synchronicity biz call a clue. I got Catherine on the phone and asked her the obvious questions. Did your dad have anything to do with missiles? No. Did he fight in World War II? No. Pause 2, 3. Well, there was Uncle Bob. Because of course there was. In fact, 2 of her uncles, twin brothers Robert and David, had flown fighter planes in World War II. Furthermore, their squadron had flown fighter escort for B-24 bombers over Germany. And yes, that squadron had flown fighter escort on many of the same missions as my Uncle Chester, including that fateful raid over Ludwigshafen. But it doesn't appear that they ever all flew at the same time. Robert was shot down and captured by the Nazis one day before David joined the squadron. David was later shot down and killed, which is why Catherine didn't mention him. She never knew him. Her Uncle Robert lived a long life and retired in Hendersonville, North Carolina, a town just down the road from where I lived in Asheville. I must have driven past his place hundreds of times. If I'd met him before he passed away, would that have helped me understand all this better? Because I could sure use the help. Having the universe intrude on your art, your life, your family, in ways that are sometimes good, sometimes not. And underneath it all, a hint of danger, or tragic, or hopeful. Something important that I should be focusing on. I just know that there's a puzzle here, and I'm scratching in the dirt, occasionally tripping over a new piece, in spite of myself. My friend Sally from the Art Patrol and I were hitchhiking from Pennsylvania to Nebraska and got picked up by a truck driver. Somewhere in Illinois, I was doing a crossword puzzle. One clue was, small town in Illinois, 5 letters. I looked up in annoyance like, what a stupid clue. The very second that a sign whizzed by on the highway. Oh, Paris. Okay, thanks. I wrote it down. It fit. Okay, that was weird. So now, years later, I've decided to check it out. I went online to see if there was any connection to my Uncle Chester like before. What I found is that in Chester's bombing group, the 389th, there was a Sergeant Arthur Hand from Paris, Illinois. He had been a B-24 waist gunner, although not in Chester's plane. Speaking with Arthur's relatives, I found that he had been on that fateful mission over Ludwigshafen, and they said he spoke of it often. After Chester went home, Arthur flew several more missions with one or the other Mogul brother flying escort. This is like a big crossword puzzle. And just a word here about the long gap in this timeline. In the 1980s, back at the Art Patrol, we used to raise money at festivals by selling people Polaroids of themselves as great works of art. Mind you, this was long before cell phones or Photoshop. I started doing the same thing when I needed money in Chicago, walking around festivals in Grant Park, right across the street from the Art Institute. I could make $200 a day. Eventually, I was doing it more for fun than for money. People loved it so much, and the whole thing inspired in me interesting questions about the role of art in our lives and vice versa, the role of the observer in art. In 1996, I was working on the plans for a large stained glass window that incorporated those themes along with Synchronicity. I had the final drawings ready to start building when our family was struck by tragedy with the death of my brother Mark. The meaning of the design changed for me dramatically, and I never wound up building it. From 2008 till 2018, I had a jewelry business. I worked in fused glass. My best-selling item was the hand flower bracelet. One day in August of 2018, I got an email from a customer. She had bought one of my spiral bracelets but had broken it. I told her to mail it to me and I would repair it. The very next day, I got a phone call from a different customer who had the same problem. She lived in the Augusta area where my next show was, so she said she would see me there. In the meantime, the first customer's bracelet arrived in the mail. I replaced the spiral, although in a different color, and mailed it back to her. At the Augusta show, the woman who had called showed up and handed me her broken spiral bracelet. I replaced her spiral and forgot about it until I put the two together. It was cut from the same glass, broken in exactly the same place. I'd made over 1,000 spirals in dozens of colors and never had even one come back broken like this. Now here are two, cut from the same glass, broken in the same way, and they'd contacted me virtually on the same day. Later that same day, two things happened. The first customer emailed me to say she'd received her repaired spiral bracelet and how happy she was with it. At the same time, a giant spiral was destroying my booth with high winds at the Augusta show. This would be my last outdoor show after 10 years of touring. Closing up my business contributed greatly to going back to making art about synchronicity. One thing I now had time to do was a large painting based on that window design, and then the sync generator, which I'd also designed many years ago. The coincidences that immediately followed, however obscure and bizarre they were, confirmed for me that this is real. Despite my joking around, I know I'm not some kind of wizard. Synchronicity happens to us all, and this persistent synchronicity, as I'm calling it, probably happens more than we realize. You just have to be open to it. My hope is that laying it all out here will help someone else figure it all out someday. Has anything like this happened to you? After working on this video for over a year, I'm almost ready to put it out there. I sent a version of what you just watched to just a few people to get some reactions, and the very next day one of my oldest friends, Richard, was the first to respond with this email. I did some research on his dad, and found that he'd worked at Lockheed in the Missile and Space Division. Doing what? I asked, already suspecting what the answer would be.
You know, he didn't really say a lot about what he was working on. At one point, my anti-war, anti-Vietnam War sentiments kind of boiled him over and claimed he worked on the Polaris missile.
The Polaris submarine-launched nuclear missile, the predecessor to the Trident missile, whose failed test launch in 1989 served as part of the inspiration for the sculpture I was working on at the time, The Clay's the Thing, as seen here in my brief attempt at a comic book sometime in the mid-90s. One detail I didn't mention earlier is that these barriers the salmon were colliding with represented the blades of a submarine propeller. Here's yet another coincidental connection to other children of men who worked on nuclear missiles. For the Army, Navy, Air Force, did the Marines develop their own nuclear missiles during the Cold War? I predict I'm about to find out. Of course, should be said, the meaning could just be knock it off with the bombs and the missiles and the bombs and the rockets and the bombs and the drones and the missiles and the drones and the drones and the drones and the drones. Just saying.
I saw you and I thought, man, that's the coolest costume I have ever. You know, you guys were famous for months after that.
Some have to do with the background of imagery in my artwork. Some coincidences relate to books I was reading while making the artwork. I don't want to tell this one because the central character disappeared right before I tried to get in touch with him. Some stories are too crazy even for me to tell. Some things I'm still studying to see if they're relevant. One story from 1997 may still have shoes left to drop, and one that Richard started telling me that same year that won't be finished for centuries.